there were anti-federalists who were present at the convention. George Mason of Virginia was present at the convention. So it would seem that his input in these debates is very important. And of course, the anti-federalists may have lost the battle over the Constitution, but in many respects they won the war, because a lot of what they wanted, they ultimately got through the addition of the Bill of Rights. So it's important to take into consideration both those Federalist and anti-Federalist opinions. All right, let's move it along here a little bit and talk about what Madison set out to do when he started working on the Constitution. Madison is considered to be the primary architect of the Constitution. He was the one who brought the Virginia plan with him to Philadelphia. His great genius was he knew that if you ever have to convene a meeting, be the one who sets the agenda. Be the one who comes with the order of business. And that's what he did. He brought the Virginia plan, and that became the blueprint from which the debates originated. It got revised and so forth, but he was the one who brought the blueprint. And his task was how to create a more perfect union from imperfect human beings. Madison realized that human nature is fallible, that human beings will not act always in the best interests of the Commonwealth when given their liberty to act otherwise. And so the issue is, how is he going to create a government that is going to create virtue, that is going to create concern for the common welfare out of the private, selfish interests and actions of individual citizens. He writes in Federalist number 51, in a much clearer statement, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, of course, men are not angels. And therefore, his task is to create a government that is going to take those imperfect beings and create a more perfect kind of government. He sees this as a matter of striking a proper balance between liberty and power. The more power government has, the less liberty people have. The more liberty people have, the less power government has. If people have too much liberty, then government is powerless and it breaks down into anarchy. If government has too much power, then it intrudes on the people's liberty and it becomes despotic. So somewhere, think of it as a seesaw or scales, somewhere you've got to strike exactly the right balance between those two extremes. Now, what's the model for doing this? The model, I'm sorry to report to you, is French. It comes to us from the 18th century political philosopher Montesquieu, who was one of these towering figures of the Enlightenment. Professor Mott might agree with me if I call him the first true political scientist, in the sense that he's trying to apply the insights and ideas of science to the study of politics. And one of the things Montesquieu does is he surveys all of history, and he surveys all of the known world at that time. And his insight is that there is no one true best form of government. Rather, governments are suited according to the peculiarities of the people they govern. They change according to geography. They change according to the people's national character and so forth. One of the things he argues is that governments that are democratic in nature tend to be very small. Republics are small because they have to have homogeneous people. They have to have people who share homogeneous interests. The larger nations get, the more territories, climates, geographies, peoples they include, the more likely they are to be empires, to be monarchies, to rely on autocracy, to rely on the rule of the few. The bigger a land, the larger the population, the more heterogeneous it is that you're trying to govern, the more you're going to rely on a very strong single ruler, like a king or an emperor, or a very small select group of rulers. But in all of this, in this concern for striking a proper balance between liberty and power, Montesquieu is actually a great admirer of the British system. He's a great admirer of the British Constitution, which is an unwritten constitution. It's really just a collection of precedents and customs that Britain has engaged in since going back to the Magna Carta. But he lays out, his blueprint for the British Constitution looks something like this. The British government has separation of powers. There are three branches to the British government. There's the King, the Lords, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. Each one of those branches represents a branch of society. Monarchy, the aristocracy, and the democracy. What makes the British Constitution so good is it balances the interests of those different branches of society by representing them in their own branches of government. And then it uses a system of checks and balances to make sure that no single branch becomes overpowerful and intrudes upon the liberty of the others. If one particular branch becomes too powerful, then these abuses will result. If the monarchy is too powerful, what you get is tyranny. And of course, that's what, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson accused King George III of. Tyranny, because that's what kings do when they get too much power. If the aristocracy becomes too powerful, you get oligarchy, the rule of the few. And if the democracy becomes too powerful, the result is anarchy. No government. Absolute liberty in the breakdown of government. And this was the system, of course, that developed in the colonies, because the colonies had imitated the British form of government. And so in colonial governments, typically you had a royal governor who represented the king, is the executive branch of government in the colonial government. You had a council that was appointed by the governor and advised the governor. And then you had an assembly that mimicked the powers of the House of Commons back in Britain. It was elected by the people, or really a rather small portion of the people based on property ownership and things like that. But that's the model of balance that Madison wants to restore to the United States when he sits down to draft the Constitution. And the problem, as far as he's concerned, is that since independence, the federal and the state governments have become imbalanced. They're out of balance. And the problem isn't tyranny, it's anarchy. The democratic element has been strengthened too much at the expense, particularly, of the executive branch of government. The state governments, after independence, write their own constitutions. The states write their constitutions before the federal government writes the articles or obviously the Constitution of 1787. And what they do is, for the most part, they retain that three-branch system, but they substantially weaken the powers of the governor by, for example, putting term limits on governors. The state of Virginia still has its term limits on governors. Some of our states still have that. They weaken the powers of the upper house at the expense of the lower house. They expand the franchise. They reduce the amount of property that's required in order to vote. They expand the number of representatives who sit in the lower house. In the colonial period, some of these lower houses only had 30 members. They were very small representative bodies. In the wake of independence, these representative bodies are enlarged, which makes it easier for more people, obviously, to have a voice in government. In some cases, state capitals are moved. They are moved from eastern cities, which are seen to be the seats of power for the wealthy and the elite, and they are moved west so that people in the west will have easier access to their government. It'll be easier for them to get involved in. This is what happens, why we go from Philadelphia to Harrisburg in the state of Pennsylvania at this particular time. So at the state governments, there's this desire to expand the democratic element at the expense of the monarchy or the aristocratic element. A common phrase used by the Federalists, people like Madison, to describe what was happening in the state governments at this time was, the scum boils to the top. When you apply heat to a pot, the scum will boil to the top. And so the revolution had applied heat to American society and government. And in that jumble of revolution, in that uncertainty and instability, the scum had boiled to the top. People had gotten into state government and acquired power in state government who were not thinking about the welfare of the whole, who were simply trying to enrich themselves. And that was a problem. And then there is the issue of the Articles of Confederation. the Articles of Confederation established what it called a firm league of friendship between the states, a confederation of the separate sovereign states. And so the only branch of government under the Articles of Confederation, the only branch of federal government, excuse me, was the Confederation Congress. It was a unicameral body. There was no upper house, there was no lower house.